This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jenny Ifft, K-State Policy Specialist, starts today's show with her first Farm Bill segment, discussing what the Farm Bill is and life in agriculture before it. Continuing the show is K-State 4-H Agricultural Sciences Specialist Kelsey Nordyke with information on the upcoming horse judging competition in Salina. U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bain and Joaquin Altoro, Rural Housing Service Administrator, also joined to quickly share about rural housing opportunities. Completing today's show is K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses several steps dairy farmers can take to reduce feed costs this summer. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and I'd like to introduce to you a new segment that's going to be happening on Tuesdays, and that's going to be a segment talking about the Farm Bill, and we're going to be joined by Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchball Agriculture Policy Chair Jenny Ifft to talk about things related to the Farm Bill, first going back in time and talking about the history, and then eventually we'll move on into current events. And so in to talk about it, obviously now, we have Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So to get started on everything, what is the Farm Bill?
Well, if you want the official definition, it's an omnibus, multi-year law that governs an array of agricultural and food programs. Now let me translate that for you. So the vast majority of the money goes for the food safety net. So SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as Food Snaps, that helps hungry families. So you have a safety net for people that might be hungry. You also have a safety net for people that produce food, programs like crop insurance, and you have payments to producers who adopt conservation practices that have broader social benefits. So that's the bulk of the spending under the Farm Bill. You also have a smaller amount of spending that goes to programs that affect almost anybody. So whether it's supporting some of the research and extension that happens here at K-State, 4-H programs, the U.S. Forest Service, money for rural governments to make investments, credit for farmers who wouldn't otherwise have access to credit, funding to develop markets for U.S. commodities overseas. The list goes on and on.
Really quite a large list, and I know the Farm Bill's really been around for as long as I've been alive. So was there always a Farm Bill?
No, there hasn't been a Farm Bill always. The first major Farm Bill was during the Great Depression, 1933, and that was a major turning point for farm policy in the U.S.
So even before the Farm Bill, was the government still involved with things related to agriculture?
Oh, definitely. And a lot of that relates to the broader development of the United States as a country, expanding to all 50 states. But I would largely characterize the role of government in agriculture before the Great Depression focused on development of laws, our legal system that had a lot of impact on agriculture, as well as the development of what I would call public goods.
And so what are those public goods?
So generally, a public good, you could define it as something that benefits everybody or a large group of people, but it's something that's difficult for individuals or for the free market to provide. So you can think of national defense, clean air, roads.
Talking about some of that legal development that happened before the first Farm Bill, what are those things?
In a lot of different areas, so a lot of development around laws around trade. So over history, we've seen trade expand and sort of shrink. So you have tariffs put into place, or restrictions put into place, and restrictions taken away. So a lot of those developments have happened over the history of the U.S. Also development of property rights. So even, sort of defining what a property boundary is and who enforces that. You had the Homestead Act. That was a major legal development. Patents were developed in the history of the U.S., so a lot of technologies used in agriculture are protected by patents, as patents also encourage investment into new technologies. Labor laws, especially historically, agriculture was very labor-intensive, so those were being developed. Food safety laws, that started around 1906, had a major impact on how food is processed, public trust in our food supply, and antitrust laws. Also relevant to agriculture, laws for cooperatives were developed around this time. In the early 1900s, you started having a lot of laws around farm lending as well.
So what were some laws or acts of Congress during that time frame also?
So there was a lot of public goods during the century that were sort of developed, supported by the government the century before the Great Depression in the 1930s. So you have development of railroads, so that vastly increased the movement of people, but also of goods across the U.S. So a lot of market development. River navigation was developed. Rural electrification had just started at that point, so only 10% of farms or rural homes had electricity in 1930, but again, there was some development in that direction. You also had the founding of the USDA during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. And one of their original purposes, and I like this as an economist, was a collection of development of statistics. But there was also, at the same time, the Morrill Act, the founding of the land-grant system. K-State was the first land-grant university that came after the Morrill Act. There was also funding for research that happened, 1887. A couple of decades later, you had funding for extension at land-grant universities, and then you had more funding for vocational agriculture and other technical programs in high schools.
A lot of information there, a lot of work that the government was doing in terms of farmers and agriculture. And so economically, what were things looking like before the Great Depression for agriculture?
Yeah. Well, if you go to the period before World War I, it was pretty good. So there's something called the Golden Age of Agriculture, and that usually gets defined as 1909 to 1914. And it was a period where there was a lot of production, so a large supply of agricultural goods, but there was also high prices. So everybody was doing pretty well during that time. Usually when there's some type of global conflict, demand increases as well. Prices tend to increase. So farmers were doing pretty well before the 1920s. So really there was no roaring 20s for agriculture. It came a decade earlier. And then you shifted to the 1920s. Prices declined, but production was still high. It's still, in agriculture, we produce commodities. There's ebbs and flows in prices. So by the 1920s, while the general economy was fine, producers were starting to see lower prices and suffer.
What would have the home life almost of agriculture producers almost been like during that time? Would it have been a struggle?
It was generally sort of hard physical labor, and you were subject to the whims of the market. So individual farmers didn't have much control over markets. Now there's things they could do. So, you would have a lot highly diversified farms, other things, other decisions they would make. But it was generally a hard life. And during that time, the average farm family was a lot poorer than the average non-farm family or family living in an urban area.
And so we're touching back to some legal work there with the government. The Baby Farm Bill, something we talked about beforehand, and I thought it was kind of an interesting name that you like to call it.
So first of all, if you go back to before the Great Depression, the prevailing belief of government or in society was that government didn't have a role in safety net. So government, they were developing legal institutions to support markets and other things, but that government, there was no social safety net programs, there was no food assistance, there was no support for the income of farm families. That was just the sort of the prevailing belief that government didn't have a role in that private institutions should do it. There was a quote that was attributed to Calvin Coolidge: "Farmers never made much money. I do not believe there is much we can do about it." And so it's not that everybody felt that way. It was just that was the majority, the prevailing point of view. Although at that time, especially during the 1920s, when farmers were struggling, there was ideas that were starting to be pushed forward. One of the more famous proponents was the owner of the Moline Plow Company, who said you can't sell a plow to a busted customer. And he was supporting this idea that there needs to be a federal farm board that buys commodities and stores them and puts them back into the market. These ideas did gain some popularity over time. To what ended up happening in 1929, there was a sort of small farm bill, baby farm bill I like to call it, that allocated a small amount of money towards that.
And with them buying it and then reintegrating it into the markets, did that cause this problem?
Well, it didn't really help. They didn't have a lot of resources, $500 million. So, they started buying commodities. Prices were low. So they were buying commodities. That was what would be considered a fair price for farmers. So they spent all their money, markets still weren't better. They had all these commodities on hand, and they ended up putting them back on the market, which further depressed prices. So that act was not very effective.
Would that be a helpful or a not helpful thing looking forward to creating the first Farm Bill?
So I think there was some experience that was gained during this. To some degree, how the government supported farm income was through supporting prices, and the government was involved in the storage of commodities as well for several decades after that. So it does help us understand, what the U.S. government did in agriculture through the mid-90s was really driven by the best tools the government had available to help very poor farm families in the 1920s and 1930s.
And one of the tools for farm families was something we still talk about now, markets, even on the international scope. So what about ag exports during that time frame?
So agriculture really got hurt by this. There's something called the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930. And this was legislation that imposed tariffs. It was protectionist. It decreased trade. And that led to a decline in agricultural exports. So 65% between 1929 to 1933. So this lack of access to export markets further depressed prices for crops and livestock at a time when, again, everybody was already suffering.
Ginny, a lot of information talking about the time frame even before the Farm Bill, so I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. I appreciate you coming in and giving us some information about it.
My pleasure.
That was K-State Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair Ginny Ifft with information about the time before the first Farm Bill. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and as summer picks up, so do 4-H activities seem to pick up, and so one that's coming up soon is state horse judging. And in to talk about that, we have K-State 4-H Agricultural Sciences Specialist, Kelsey Nordyke. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Shelby.
So getting started with state horse judging happening June 15th.
Yes, this Kansas State 4-H Horse Judging Contest is June 15th in Salina. This is an opportunity for our Kansas 4-Hers who are 9 and older that have an interest in learning how to judge horses, or just have an interest in horses, or just an interest in judging, to come and compete. So oftentimes some of our 4-H members who participate in the contest are not even enrolled in the 4-H Horse Project. They either love judging or they love horses, and it's just an opportunity to go out and have some fun with their teammates and their friends, and to learn more about the horse industry.
And something I want to touch on real fast is judging versus showing. When you say judging, it's more like livestock judging, like you're ranking things.
Yes. So in horse judging, our kids are actually going to judge the same or similar classes that they would exhibit in at a horse show. And so typically what a youth judging contest has is several halter classes, which is where we judge the conformation or how the horse is put together. And then there are lots of riding classes. So inevitably we'll have Western pleasure. We might have a hunter under saddle class, which is an English class. Potentially we could have reining, horsemanship, trail. There's lots of opportunities. And so it really kind of mirrors the classes that our 4-Hers could potentially show in if they're in the horse project.
And what do participating in activities like this do for 4-Hers?
So many things. On the one hand, judging really provides kids the technical aspects, whether it's horse judging, livestock, meats, or whatever. If you're participating in horse judging, you're going to learn how those classes are judged or what a judge is looking for. So if you also are enrolled in the horse project and are showing in those shows, you have a better idea of what the judge is looking for. And so that really kind of gives you a leg up on your competition, because you know how to work through those classes. The other part of that is if you are a youth who is potentially interested in a career in the horse industry, you have a better idea, and that better prepares you for those careers. So there's that technical side, but as a mom and as a youth development specialist and as a product of our 4-H horse judging program and livestock judging program, there's those soft skills too. So you really get to be a part of a team, but grow as an individual while you're a part of that team. There's also the opportunity to learn how to organize your thoughts, and with oral reason skills, learning how to defend your opinions. There's prioritization because, we're going to look at different traits that we're going to select for and how we prioritize for those. In addition to that, it really gives you great public speaking and interview skills through the oral reasons process. So many exciting things to do. And I always tell kids that they're never going to remember how they placed in a contest, but they're going to remember those trips in the van with their friends, or they're going to remember getting to go and see a world champion somewhere, or some of those real experiences. But while we're giving these kids these fun experiences, we're also teaching them great leadership and personal development skills.
Kelsey, you and I both participated in 4-H, and as we look forward in these next few months, a lot of county fairs are happening where, at least for my home county, we did a lot of the judging things also there for horticulture or family and consumer sciences or poultry. So I didn't participate in all of those as a project. However, I would just go do the judging because it's something fun, and why not go do it? Just got to learn something new. So if youth are thinking about, I didn't do poultry, or I don't really know anything, why would you encourage them just to go try a new judging opportunity?
Well, I think the greatest part of that, Shelby, is every time we try something new or we step outside of our comfort zone, it really increases our self-confidence. So that's where I would begin with that. But on the other hand, just trying something new, you may find an interest that you didn't know you had. So when I was in 4-H, I knew a lot of kids that judged both horses and livestock, but they weren't interested in any of those projects as a project. But it was something that they enjoyed doing and they enjoyed learning about. So you may learn something new that you never knew you had an interest in. And so I would always encourage you to try some of those things. It gives you, those judging contests give you an opportunity to try a project without actually enrolling in the project and taking the project throughout the year.
And if someone's listening and maybe aren't in Kansas 4-H, but hopefully we would encourage them to at least look into it, is it worth them going to county fairs or going to the Kansas State Fair and looking at these different projects? What would your encouragement be for someone to look into joining 4-H?
Absolutely. So I would tell you to start with your local county extension office. And if you are new and don't really know what county you're in or what extension office to contact, you can always go to kansas4h.org and you can find general information there. But I always encourage you to reach out to your local extension professionals first, and they'll tell you what their local program offers. And those county fairs, like you said, Shelby, are coming up starting in July. So visit your county fair. Look and see what other kids are doing within your county and see what you might be interested in, and you might learn something new.
Within 4-H, but then also people coming in to look, the connection I think that you can build within the community of agriculture, but also the community of 4-H is something that's really meaningful.
Yes, absolutely. I have friends that I met at 4-H camp in the 3rd grade that I'm still friends with, and they came from clear across the state. And so the connections that you make in 4-H can be lifelong and really impactful.
K-State Research and Extension does a lot of teaching and education, but is also involved with Kansas 4-H and youth development. So a wide scope of not only helping our producers learn, but also helping our youth learn. So as Kelsey, as someone who's been through the program and is obviously loved it enough to come back and do it, what were some of your favorite memories in 4-H?
Oftentimes when you ask someone what their favorite memories are, they're all about the county fair, but it's never about how you placed or how you performed at the county fair. I remember as a teen, we had room in our beef barn that we had a family that would bring old couches and stuff, and we would hang out in the beef barn and play cards all afternoon. And so it was those connections. But it was also the connections in the back of the judging van. So, now we have to sit in our seats and wear our seatbelts. But back in the day, we had an entire open area in the back of our judging van. And I remember in middle school, riding to contests early in the morning and just laughing and giggling and having the best time. So I got to go on a lot of trips because of 4-H across the state and across the nation, partly because of judging, but partly just because of some of those opportunities that our local agents and our local supporters offered. And so I really got to learn more about our world, and it opened up my eyes to more possibilities than what were available just in my home county, and really has allowed me to come back to a rural setting and give back to the youth of our communities.
And so the reason we are talking today was June 15th is the state horse judging in Salina. However, if you can't make that and you want to go see the horses, I recommend the Kansas State Fair. When can people come do that?
The Kansas State 4-H Horse Show is the second weekend of the State Fair. We're going to start on September 14th. We have rearranged that schedule just a little bit, so I would encourage you to check and see what that schedule looks like on the Kansas 4-H website. But those entries for our Kansas 4-Hers are going to be due August 1st, and we'll show that second weekend of the State Fair and would encourage anyone to come out and look and see what our kids are doing and accomplishing.
Kelsey, thanks for joining me today and talking about horse showing and horse judging, but also just 4-H in general. I appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was Kansas 4-H Agricultural Sciences Specialist Kelsey Nordyke with information about the Kansas 4-H Horse Judging Competition that's taking place June 15th in Salina, Kansas. If you're interested in 4-H, you can find more information about the program at www.kansas4h.org. That will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on actday.net. We're now going to be joined by Rod Bain and Rural Housing Service Administrator Joaquin Altoro from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. USDA's Rural Housing Service offers various programs to offer affordable housing options to rural residents.
June is recognized as National Homeowners Month. Yet, as USDA Rural Development Rural Housing Administrator Joaquin Altoro points out,
a lot of people don't know that under USDA that we have a very important and critical area that deals with housing.
He notes the variety of programs under the RD umbrella to assist with rural housing availability and needs.
Single-family housing, the ability for one to either rehabilitate and or own or preserve their homeownership. And then there's the multifamily housing where we are actively engaged in affordable rental housing across rural America.
The administrator adds both rural and tribal communities and residents benefit not just via physical buildings and financing.
We also work with folks that are borrowers and helping them reduce and pause their mortgage payments to work with their budget.
More details about USDA rural housing programs are available through state rural development offices or online at www.rd.usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That was the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and Rural Housing Service Administrator Joaquin Altoro with a little bit of information about rural housing opportunities. If you'd like to find out more information, you can go to www.rd.usda.gov, which you can find in today's show notes on actday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. If you're reaching your destination and don't want to miss out on that information, you can find today's show and past shows on actday.net.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Reducing feed costs during the summer months can be difficult. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says producers can take several steps to help cut feed costs. This includes correct face management of stored silages, cleaning bunks, and feeding animals only what's needed.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning how we might reduce feed costs as we go through the next few months. You know, as we look at ways to reduce feed cost and with the decrease in the price of milk on farm, one of the things we're going to have to be concerned about is margin in the next several months. And there are some things you can do to actually reduce your feed costs that will help your overall margin. When it comes to forages, you've got forages stored, and I'm thinking mostly of your silages. So whether it be corn silage or alfalfa haylage or maybe some sort of small grain haylage, it's a wet feed and can spoil very quickly in the summer heat. So correct face management is really important, keeping that face small and making sure that we use enough off that face every day to keep that fresh. So during the summertime, it would be best if we could use about 12 inches off the face every day. I know some of you probably have silos that are large enough that that's not possible, so maybe you only feed down half and then go back and get the other half of the face to try to move back in the silo a little further each day. Excellent face management during the summer is also very important. making sure that we only knock down as much feed as what we're going to actually feed in that day, so that at the end of the day we actually have a nice, clean, straight face, and that way we'll see less heating overnight before the next feeding day. Cleaning bunks on a regular basis is going to be an important part of your feeding strategy as well. Making sure that we only feed what we need to each day so we don't carry over feed to the next day. Secondary fermentation in that bunk can account for a lot of waste if you're feeding too much feed. So you're going to have to make some decisions. I know a lot of times in the dairy industry with our lactating dairy cows, we want to try to feed a little extra each day so they always have feed in front of them. And during the summertime, we just probably need to keep that to a minimum because likely that feed's going to spoil overnight, and we're going to have to throw it away the next day. So trying to reduce the amount that we throw away every day is very, very important. We want to feed the cows adequately. That's the challenge. So if we're feeding later in the day, our last load of feed, we've got a chance to maybe adjust the bunk a little bit so that we can reduce the amount that we might have to throw away the next day. Finally, one thing to think about as we begin harvest of small grains as well as alfalfa, for putting that up as silage, making sure that we do a good job of packing our silage to exclude the air from that so that we get a reduction in the amount of heating that occurs. Harvest moisture is very, very important. Again, we want to stay between that 35 and 40% dry matter as we harvest these forages, but we still have to do an adequate job of packing. Don't forget about the inoculants. Those are very important. Again, lactic acid bacteria inoculants are probably the thing to consider for alfalfas as well as small grain silages, making sure that we get that applied correctly, and the best place to do that would be your forage chopper. And then make sure you get it covered quickly. So do a great job of packing, apply your inoculants as you chop, and then make sure you get the cover on so that we preserve as much of that expensive forage as we can. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder that June is National Dairy Month. Since 1939, National Dairy Month has encouraged families to make milk their beverage of choice based on its nutritional value. According to the Dairy Alliance, dairy's rich history continues with communities, companies, and people from across the country observing National Dairy Month in a variety of ways, including tours, as well as an opportunity to taste the many dairy products produced. Mike encourages you to take advantage of tours that are being offered in your area. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.